Day 4. It was a viscous wind that awoke me from slumber. I was being buffeted by sheets of sand that had me up quickly, spluttering and shielding my face with my hand. I hadn't set up any shelter the previous night, as the weather had been clear and mild. Packing my scattered belongings up was a challenge, and I had to run down a spare shirt that I had begun migrating off the beach. After bundling everything together, I set my stride and headed west, back towards the main roads. The highways out of Tenora was wide and well maintained, covered with a unique soil on the surface. It was special in the fact that, over time, it increasingly solidified and became more resilient with use, truly a marvel. Just a short way up from the water fields, where I had just come from, the road split in two. The northern path followed the coastline, eventually meeting up with the other larger coastal cities, and even further beyond, the lands of ice where few people dwelt. The western road veered off at a sharp angle, leading into the heart of the world. From a crude map I possessed of the inhabited lands, I had decided to go inwards, where much of the land was still wild and unexplored. Going west, the road took me into terrain that gradually became more elevated and less flat. Each hill was a miniature adventure, getting to the top of one and being rewarded with a new horizon every time. The road went on like this for quite some time, dotted by small groves of trees and herds of animals grazing on the luscious grass, until after a final, more sizable hill, everything opened up into a wide, vibrant valley, a lazy river flowing through its base. Along the serene river, a town had been built, with multiple roads leading to and from. It stood out starkly from its surroundings of warm greens and soft blues by way of its vivid array of colors that instantly caught the eye of anyone traveling by. Walking into the city, I was welcomed by a festive mood that permeated the air. People milled about talking animatedly, children darted through the streets, and the houses and shops were being smothered with colorful clay found abundantly on the streets, lying in troughs for anyone so inclined to liberally use any structure of their choosing. Every sound coming from the town was pleasant and joyous, and laughter rang out frequently. I had planned that the start of my journey should coincide with the Bounty Festival Week. It was a wild and special time, when the celebration of the end of winter would commence, and the townsfolk would fish out extra clay from the river, where a large amount found in an array of striking colors from the river and its tributaries. Then the clay would be dried and ground into a powder, before then mixing it and applying it freely to any available surface in the town. For the people, it was a source of local pride to have such a unique resource, and one that helped support the town and its inhabitants financially as well. As I walked the streets, more of the remaining walls were being recolored haphazardly. Some people were more refined in their efforts, painting murals or interesting geometric patterns, using every hue of the rainbow. All this work would be washed away with the first couple of spring rains, back into the river from where it came. My afternoon was spent with a small group of locals, who invited me to join in on vivifying a wall they were working on coating in color. With much laughter and silliness, applying thick mixtures of clay by throwing and brushing, short work was made of the wall. Afterwards, I was asked to join for a meal, and some music which I quickly obliged to. I spent a few hours just enjoying the company of the townsfolk, while they passed around instruments for us to play as the food cooked. We made quite the racket, and I had little to no skill with the instrument I was given, but no one really seemed to notice. The meal was served, and while we ate, people would volunteer to read exciting short stories from a scroll, much to the diner's delight. Saying my goodbyes, I walked out and down along the river for a bit, before going and finding lodgings that had been recommended to me in the center of the town. The establishment was cozy, and the place was pretty clean. Then, taking a soak to wash off the day's dust and color, I climbed into a very comfortable bed, and was asleep before any thought had a chance to enter my mind. Day 5. Upon waking up, I felt completely rested. The good company and activities of the previous day had my spirits high, looking forward to what I might encounter today. Early in the morning has always been my preferred time to awaken. Early even compared to village life standards, getting up even before the sun. The time this practice afforded me has proven to be some of my most personal, meaningful moments. That is because, in the hour or so of stillness, that is the time when I most connect with the Great Spirit, spending my time in meditation and listening to the universe. The presence and peace I feel during these times are unmatched, and throughout the day I feel as if I can summon back brief glimpses of the intensity I experienced while focused. After my morning ritual, I meandered into the dining area of the inn, perking up at the smell of freshly baked bread, courtesy of a tirelessly laboring cook, probably the one only person in the whole town to even rise earlier than myself. He had just pulled golden perfection out of the glowing stone oven. Striking a deal with him, I was able to get a massive loaf of flaky bread all to myself. Splitting it in half and munching on a piece as I went upstairs to gather my things, and with bread in hand, I walked out the city gates just as the darkness was receding from the land, and the wild colors of the city creeped into existence. The land west of the town of Nethin became much more untamed compared to the nurtured and cultivated areas I had just come from. Well cared for roads connected all the major cities in the kingdom, but the small towns and villages had to settle for country roads, and where vegetation was heavy, sometimes almost indistinguishable paths. I preferred these routes, and chose to take the more roundabout ways when possible, being rewarded with solitude and abounding natural spectacles. The hilly terrain gave way after a while to an expansive plain covered in tall grass, only a single dirt track cutting through it for miles, straight down the middle. It was not even midday yet, and the sun was already beginning to warm my shoulders to an uncomfortable level. Heading quickly for the shade of the tall grass, I began to walk among the shorter stalks on the outer edges, greeted by humidity and an accompanying strong earthy smell. By noon, some of the patches along the road were reaching the height of my head, obscuring my surroundings and increasingly leaving me no choice but to blindly follow the road. Breaking down a small area of grass to the side of the road, I carved out a little clearing in which to eat a light meal before carrying on. It was pleasant, if not a little claustrophobic though. The birds chirped all around me, and insects droned on. I swatted with frustration at the ones that dared venture too close to my meal. But then, mid-bite, and instantaneously, the birds were silent. No sound could be heard. A short pause. Then, out of the deep, tangled grass came the sound of foliage being trampled down, the force of which indicated something huge. I froze, unsure of what to do next. From what I knew, most of the creatures that dwelt to the east were relatively harmless, but those that definitely weren't meant to be trifled with. For this reason, most people preferred not to travel alone, save on well-used roads. Whatever this creature was, it seemed in no hurry, as crunching grass and the sound of large areas of displaced blades reverberated through the area. The brush was too thick for any person to be making their way through with such ease. Then, from somewhere behind, a grunt, followed by a snuff, rang out, coming from head height at least. Almost losing control of my legs, I spun around, spear raised. Nothing to be seen. Creeping my way backwards into the slight vantage the road gave me, I waited, standing frozen for what felt like an eternity, until I realized how sore I felt from my clenched muscles. As quietly as I could manage, I gathered my gear and walked potentially the softest I have ever down the road, both eyes peeled for danger. After an hour of walking, my nerves had just begun returning, when I saw ahead of me that a large portion of the grass bordering the path was beaten down on both sides going across. Huge patches of earth had been upturned all along this forged route, and there were thick clumps of silver-gray hair caught among the undergrowth. My thoughts raced to the mammoth bears that sometimes migrated these lands. Or perhaps the fur belonged to something being dragged and eaten by a serpent of epic proportions. Judging by the width of the path, it could be upwards of 40 feet in length. My only chance of survival would be to not cross the paths with such a beast. Quickly and quietly, I moved along at a brisk pace on high alert. The more distance I put between this place and myself, the better. No further signs or sounds came as I went, but my nerves never really settled again. Dusk was falling, and I had only to put on a few miles, and after a few more, it was too dark to reasonably go any further, even though I hadn't cleared the tall grass yet. I made no attempts at a camp or shelter, opting instead to settle in a small clearing on the side of the road, presumably where other travelers had stayed recently. Without the sounds of my footsteps, the ambient noises of the surrounding darkness became intensified. Night birds called out to each other, and nocturnal insects played their games in the grass. All was normal until an unearthly shriek blasted through the air, followed by silence. Stiffening, I could tell that whatever it was, despite the volume of the sound, it was quite far away at this point, which gave me a little comfort. Over the next little while, there were subsequent cries and howls, each as jarring as the last, making sleep seem like an impossibility. I'm happy to report, though, I made it through the night. Day 6. Early in the day, and to my great relief, I was out of the grass, into a much more open and clear landscape, one where less danger could be lurking around every turn. The road stretched on as far as I could see over grassy plains, and a few sparse trees dotted about. I had planned my route as far as the great mountain city of Adara, and after that I would let the fates decide my course. On the way there, I would be traveling close to the living hill, which, when I had heard about it, had piqued my curiosity immensely. I headed slightly off the trail, following a landmark distinguished on the shoddy map I carried. It might take some guesswork to find it, as the ground was totally flat ahead of me, no hill in sight. A few hours of walking later, and I started to notice a very peculiar sensation. Wow, that is a hard word. The horizon began to inch down in my field of view, extremely slowly, but before my very eyes. I wasn't sure if I was seeing it correctly. I took a drink of water to stave off dehydration, but after 15 minutes, I was sure I could see more of the land ahead than I had previously, and when I looked back, the land I had been traversing was now at a slight decline to where I was. This decline only became more pronounced as the minutes went by, until, incredibly, I found myself at the summit of a massive hill that stretched for miles, and had not been there before. Still in amazement, I pulled out some food to sit and eat at the summit, savoring the marvel that I was currently a part of. The soil on the slope was loose and shifting, and everything organic seemed to cling for dear life, having to cope with living in a shifting environment. Out of curiosity, I dug a small hole just to see if there was any obvious explanation. There wasn't. I resolved to enjoy it for what it was, and reclined back to look over the country, dozing off once or twice. I stayed until the sun began making its descent from its zenith. Then I started my own descent, picking a path carefully down the far slope, careful to avoid loose stones. Traversing became easier over time, as again, just as the hill had manifested earlier, it now began to recede back down to the ground. This time, I could feel a slight tremor beneath my feet, the only perceptible way of noticing the change moment by moment. By the time I had made it down, the hill was already half the height of when I started. I wished I had a way of speeding time up, so as to see the whole motion in a fluid stream from some bird's eye view. For now, it would be one of those peculiarities in nature that are without seeming purpose, but to be enjoyed and honored. I couldn't see any person wanting to live here, or have use of such a thing. It would probably be undisturbed and uninhabited for a long time to come. Making camp in a small grove of trees, somewhat near the base of the hill, and along the road, I went about setting up a rather nice shelter, with a tarp, fire, and some moss to enhance my bedding. Then, sitting and resting, I looked out while carving a stick as the evening wore down. I frequently looked back, watching as the hill sank to its lowest point, leaving a small crater covering the area. Most curious. Maybe someday people will figure out what the cause of it was. For now, I was eager for another day. The traveling life was the perfect fit for me, and it's a shame I hadn't made it in time for earlier in life. Better late than never, though. Good stuff. Those ones were short, I think.